There is a pattern in actual collapse scenarios that few people are willing to acknowledge. The individuals who spent years preparing often die first, not because they lacked supplies or skills, but because preparation itself created the very vulnerabilities that ultimately killed them. This is not about gear failure or insufficient stockpiles. It is about how the act of preparing subtly rewires decision-making in ways that become fatal when order truly breaks down. The prepared develop blind spots. They construct mental models of crisis that make them confident, predictable, and rigid, precisely when survival demands the opposite. They accumulate resources that anchor them to locations they should abandon. They train responses that function well in imagined scenarios, yet fail catastrophically when reality deviates from the script. Meanwhile, people who never prepared often survive the initial chaos, not through strength or skill, but through fear-driven caution and the absence of anything worth defending. This analysis focuses on behavioral psychology and systems-level thinking, not tactical readiness. The question is not whether you have enough supplies, it is whether the psychology of preparedness itself has turned you into alignment failure. Stockpile creates a chain, not a physical one, but a psychological tether that binds your decision-making to a fixed location and a defensive posture. The more you accumulate, the heavier that anchor becomes, until the weight of your own preparation drowns you. This is resource gravity. It is the phenomenon where supplies stop being tools for survival and become commitments you are willing to die defending. A year's worth of food stored in your basement does not just represent calories, it represents thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours, and a mental model of crisis that assumes you will be there to use it. That assumption becomes unquestionable. The prepared mind shifts from "how do I survive" to "how do I protect what I have?" And the moment that shift occurs, you lose the most critical survival advantage of all, the ability to walk away. Consider the mathematics of mobility. Someone with nothing can relocate in under an hour. They evaluate a deteriorating situation, recognize the danger, and leave. Their decision-making is clean, unburdened by sunk costs. The prepared individual faces a very different calculation. They have a fortified home, stored food, water filtration systems, ammunition stockpiles, medical supplies. Leaving means abandoning investments that took years to build. So they stay longer than they should. They wait for confirmation that the threat is imminent, rather than acting on early warning signs. They rationalize. "I'm safer here with my supplies than out there with nothing." That rationalization kills people. History provides the data. In every urban collapse, Sarajevo, Beirut, Aleppo, the survivors were not the ones with the most supplies. They were the ones who left early, before the siege locked in, before militias established checkpoints, before staying became a death sentence. The people who stayed were often those who had the most to lose by leaving. Property owners, business owners, people with basements full of preserved food. They had resources, and those resources gave them the illusion of security. That illusion kept them in place until escape became impossible. The prepared individual does not merely accumulate supplies, they build an entire logistics infrastructure around them. They establish defensive positions. They reinforce entry points. They organize community defense networks. Each addition increases commitment to a fixed location. What began as readiness becomes a fortress mentality. And fortresses only work if the siege is short, if attackers lack artillery, if supply lines remain open. When those assumptions fail, the fortress becomes a tomb. Now contrast this with someone who never prepared. They own nothing worth defending. When violence approaches, they experience pure, unfiltered fear with no conflicting incentives. Fear tells them to run, and they have no reason to resist that instinct. They are not braver, they are not smarter, they are simply unburdened by investment. That lack of investment gives them a survival advantage the prepared individual has systematically eliminated from their decision tree. The deeper problem is optimization missation. Prepared individuals optimize for scenarios they have imagined: temporary grid failure, economic depression, natural disaster recovery. Their inventories are calibrated to those models. But actual collapse does not follow the script. It produces hybrid conditions: economic failure combined with civil conflict, supply chain breakdown, and opportunistic violence, all at once. The prepared person's stockpile was built for scenario A. Reality delivers scenario F. At that point, resources are not just useless, they are actively dangerous, because defending them requires staying in place while conditions deteriorate beyond anything their planning accounted for. Resource gravity also creates predictable behavior patterns. If you have a year of food at home, adversaries do not need to guess your next move. You will defend that location. You will return to it. You will establish routines around it. Predictability is vulnerability. Adaptive opponents observe, plan, and strike when you are most exposed. Meanwhile, the person with nothing is effectively invisible. They defend no positions. They establish no patterns. They move through chaos without creating the signatures that attract violence. This is not an argument against having supplies. It is a recognition that supplies create psychological commitments that override survival logic. The prepared individual stops asking, "What does this situation require?" and starts asking, "How do I protect my investment?" The moment your resources become more important than your flexibility, you surrender control of your decision-making to inanimate objects sitting in your basement. And that shift, quiet, invisible, and rarely questioned, marks the point where preparation stops being an advantage and becomes fundamentally an exercise in pattern recognition. You study historical collapses, identify common elements, and build response protocols based on those patterns. Economic depressions follow certain trajectories. Natural disasters create predictable cascades of infrastructure failure. Civil unrest emerges through recognizable stages. You train yourself to identify these patterns early and to execute predetermined responses. This approach works perfectly until reality presents a pattern you have never seen before. That is the moment when pattern recognition stops being an asset and becomes a cognitive trap that kills you. The human brain is a pattern-matching machine. It is extraordinarily efficient at taking novel stimuli and fitting them into existing categories. That efficiency kept our ancestors alive. That rustling in the grass matches the pattern of a predator, so run. The problem emerges when you train extensively on specific patterns. Training does not merely improve recognition, it narrows your perceptual field. You become highly sensitive to the patterns you have studied and increasingly blind to deviations from those patterns. Neuroscience research on expertise reveals the mechanism. When you develop deep knowledge in a domain, your brain builds efficient neural pathways that enable rapid pattern matching within that domain. A chess master sees board positions as chunks, not individual pieces. A radiologist recognizes pathology in X-rays that untrained eyes miss entirely. This efficiency, however, comes at a cost: reduced cognitive flexibility when encountering stimuli that do not fit established patterns. The expert brain automatically filters incoming information through existing schemas, dismissing, distorting, or deprioritizing data that does not match known templates. Now apply this to collapse scenarios. The prepared individual has studied historical patterns extensively. They know how hyperinflation develops, how supply chains fail, how civil order degrades. When crisis begins, the brain immediately starts pattern matching. This looks like the early stages of economic collapse. Activate Protocol B. The problem is that all incoming information is now filtered through that initial match. The mind looks for confirmation and dismisses contradictions. This is confirmation bias, operating in real time, optimized by training. Meanwhile, reality is doing something unprecedented. The crisis is not a pure economic collapse. It is economic failure combined with cyber infrastructure attacks, agricultural disease, and regional balkanization, emerging simultaneously, producing second-order effects no historical pattern anticipated. But the prepared brain has already committed. It is executing trained responses designed for a different crisis entirely. By the time the mismatch becomes visible, fatal decisions have already been made based on faulty categorization. Now contrast this with someone who has no training, no prepared responses, no deep knowledge of historical collapse patterns. They are terrified and confused, processing the situation as genuinely novel, because to them, it is. Their brain is not forcing events into known categories. It is collecting raw data and responding to immediate threats without the filter of expertise. This sounds like a disadvantage. In many contexts, it is. But in genuinely unprecedented situations, the absence of expertise becomes an asset. The untrained person sees what is actually happening, not what they expect to happen. There is a military concept known as fighting the last war, the tendency to prepare for conflicts that resemble previous ones rather than adapting to new realities. They wargame scenarios based on historical templates. When actual collapse occurs, they are fighting the pattern they trained for, not the reality in front of them. The Maginot Line was not poorly constructed. It was optimized for the wrong war. Prepared response protocols are the same, perfectly optimized for scenarios that are not occurring. The fatal assumption beneath all preparation is that chaos falls into predictable caddies. Economic collapse looks like this. Natural disaster follows that pattern. Civil unrest develops through these stages. Prepare for each category, build protocols, and execute when you recognize the pattern. But actual societal breakdown does not arrive as clean categories. It arrives as overlapping, mutually reinforcing cascades, producing conditions nobody has seen before. You are not experiencing an economic collapse or civil unrest. You are experiencing a hybrid failure state, containing fragments of multiple categories, plus emergent properties that belong to none of them. Trained responses are automatic. That is their purpose. They bypass slow, conscious deliberation to enable rapid action. But automaticity is only valuable when the situation matches the training environment. In novel conditions, automatic responses fire before conscious awareness can intervene. You commit to action based on pattern recognition, before realizing the match was wrong. By then, you are already executing a trained response that makes you predictable to adversaries, or dangerously misaligned with actual conditions. This is where it becomes psychologically insidious. The more training you have, the more confident you feel. In stable domains, confidence correlates with expertise. But in chaotic, unprecedented environments, confidence rooted in expertise becomes overconfidence, driven by pattern-matching errors. You feel certain because your brain has successfully matched the situation to a known pattern. That certainty makes you resist contradictory information. You dismiss early warning signs that do not fit your model. You explain deviations away as noise instead of signal. You remain committed to your protocol longer than you should, because your training tells you that doubt and hesitation get you killed. The prepared individual has traded cognitive flexibility for rapid pattern recognition and trained response. That trade-off is rational when reality matches the training. It becomes lethal when reality delivers something your training never anticipated. And the tragedy is this: you will not recognize the mismatch until your pattern-based responses have already failed catastrophically, because the very expertise meant to save you has made you blind to the true shape of the crisis unfolding around you. Every action you take to become ready generates observable patterns that mark you as a high-value target the moment order breaks down. You believe you are building security. In reality, you are painting a target, one that anyone with functional pattern recognition can identify from a distance. Start with the most obvious: physical markers, reinforced doors, security cameras, perimeter lighting, barred windows, enhanced fencing. Each modification broadcasts the message: something valuable is being protected here. In normal times, these features deter opportunistic crime. In collapse conditions, they function as advertisements to organize groups that you possess resources worth the effort of extraction. Defensive fortifications do not make you invisible. They make you interesting. Then there is the equipment signature. When the grid fails and your house is the only one with lights, you have announced generator capacity. Generator noise travels. It communicates fuel, mechanical capability, and, by implication, other supplies worth powering. In resource-scarce environments, a generator is not security. It is a beacon. The same applies to vehicles. If yours is the only truck in the neighborhood with fuel, functional tires, and visible load capacity, you are not merely mobile, you are marked. You have demonstrated foresight, and foresight implies reserves. Now consider behavioral signatures. Prepared individuals engage in bulk purchasing long before crisis hits. They establish relationships with suppliers, buy in quantities that stand out, transport loads that neighbors notice. These behaviors create social knowledge. That household has serious stockpiles. In stable times, this information is benign. When social order collapses, it becomes targeting intelligence. Your neighbors know what you have. Their extended family knows. The people they talk to when they are desperate know. Information spreads through social networks you do not control. Each person who knows represents a potential threat or a leak to more dangerous actors. Group affiliation creates even stronger signatures. Prepared individuals join communities, attend training, coordinate planning. These networks feel like force multipliers. Shared skills, mutual defense, distributed resources. But every member is also an intelligence vulnerability. In collapse conditions, people talk when they are afraid, hungry, or trading information for safety. One compromised member exposes locations, capabilities, and resources of the entire network. The larger and more organized the preparedness group, the more visible and targetable it becomes. Then there is the digital footprint. Prepared individuals participate in online forums, purchase gear through traceable transactions, post about capabilities, and consume instructional content that algorithms catalog. This creates a data trail that feels harmless in normal times. But digital records persist. Databases get hacked, sold, or accessed by actors who understand their value during breakdown. If someone wants a target list of households with supplies and capabilities, the internet has already built it. You registered yourself, voluntarily, through years of digital behavior. Now examine the game theory. In resource-scarce environments, violence becomes an economic calculation. Raiding carries risk. The reward must justify the cost. Attacking an unprepared household yields minimal return. Basic food, personal items, nothing worth serious exposure. Attacking a prepared household yields weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, preserved food, water filtration, the entire infrastructure of survival. From a predatory perspective, prepared households are optimal targets. They have concentrated value. They have advertised that value through visible markers. And they are stationary, defending fixed positions that can be observed, assessed, and attacked when vulnerable. The unprepared, by contrast, present no target signature. Their homes resemble every other desperate residence. No generators broadcasting capacity. No fortifications suggesting hidden value. No behavioral patterns indicating stockpiles. They are passed over, not because they are clever, but because they genuinely have nothing to advertise. Their poverty is camouflage. Here, the operational security paradox emerges. Prepared individuals attempt OPSEC, concealing capabilities, avoiding attention, maintaining gray man profiles. But OPSEC behaviors themselves generate signatures. You are not visibly deteriorating when everyone else is. You are not asking for help. You are not displaying the desperation that should be universal. That anomaly is information. You limit interaction. You maintain defensive awareness. You move with purpose and control. To trained observers, military veterans, experienced criminals, anyone with behavioral pattern recognition, these cues are readable. True OPSEC requires appearing genuinely unprepared. That means either you never prepared, defeating the purpose, or you possess the skill to convincingly fake desperation while maintaining hidden capabilities. They telegraph competence through body language, situational awareness, and stress responses that do not match the chaos around them. The visibility problem compounds over time. Early in collapse, actors are disorganized and reactive, but conditions stratify. Some groups develop organization, intelligence gathering, and systematic resource extraction. These evolved threats do not rely on obvious signals like generator noise. They collect data. Who had capabilities before collapse? Who shows anomalous resilience now? Who maintains networks suggesting group preparedness? They build target packages and execute. Against this level of threat, your preparation has made you a known quantity. You are on lists, formal or informal, compiled by people who understand that supplies equal power. Your visibility accumulated over years through signatures you never recognized as dangerous. Meanwhile, the person who never prepared remains invisible, background noise among thousands of desperate individuals. In environments where visibility equals vulnerability, invisibility becomes the highest form of security. The final irony is this. Prepared individuals often understand this problem intellectually. They discuss OPSEC. They warn each other about loose lips. They attempt to minimize signatures. But preparation itself is inherently visible. You cannot accumulate resources, build capability, and establish defensive positions without creating patterns that distinguish you from the unprepared majority. The moment you are different in ways that signal capacity, you are visible. And in collapse conditions, visibility to the wrong people is a death sentence. One that no amount of supplies or training than lack of supplies ever will. This is not metaphorical. It is a measurable, psychological phenomenon in which the act of preparing inflates perceived competence far beyond actual capability, leading to decisions that prove fatal in situations where uncertainty would have preserved life. The mechanism is well documented. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how individuals with incomplete knowledge experience peak confidence, while true experts recognize the limits of their understanding. In survival contexts, this creates a lethal curve. The unprepared know they are unprepared and act with appropriate terror. True experts, people who have actually survived societal collapse, understand how many variables remain outside their control and maintain cautious humility. But the moderately prepared, those who have read extensively, trained periodically, and accumulated supplies, sit at the peak of the confidence curve with dangerously incomplete knowledge. This overconfidence degrades decision-making in specific, observable ways. Prepared individuals take risks that fearful people instinctively avoid. When violence approaches, the unprepared run immediately. Their fear response is uncomplicated by belief in defensive capability. The prepared individual performs a calculation. I have firearms, training, defensible positions. I can handle this. That calculation often leads to engagement when retreat would have ensured survival. They are not braver. They are miscalibrating risk because confidence has distorted threat assessment. The research is clear. Confidence and accuracy are poorly correlated in complex, uncertain environments. People feel most certain when they have developed enough knowledge to build mental models, but have not yet encountered enough edge cases to understand how frequently those models fail. Prepared individuals possess detailed mental models of crisis scenarios. Those models generate certainty about how situations will unfold and confidence in planned responses. But actual collapse generates edge cases continuously, unprecedented combinations of factors no model anticipated. Their confidence persists even as their models fail, because confidence is rooted in preparation effort, not environmental feedback. Now consider investment bias. Someone who has spent years and significant resources preparing has psychological equity in that preparation. They have constructed an identity, someone ready for crisis, someone who will not be a victim, someone whose foresight will be validated. When crisis arrives, they are psychologically committed to proving that investment was justified. This means using their preparation, deploying capabilities, defending resources, demonstrating that years of planning were not wasted. That commitment produces irrational persistence. As conditions deteriorate, the prepared individual faces a choice: abandon stockpiles and fortifications, or stay and leverage preparation. Investment bias pushes towards staying. Leaving means admitting preparation was insufficient or misdirected. It requires writing off sunk costs. It triggers cognitive dissonance between the identity of prepared and the reality that preparation has not produced security. So they stay longer than optimal, defending positions that should be abandoned, because retreat contradicts the narrative they have built around readiness. Now contrast this with someone who never prepared. They have no investment to defend, no identity to validate, no narrative requiring confirmation. When conditions worsen, their decision-making is clean. This is dangerous. I should leave. Fear produces clarity. They are not protecting psychological equity. They are not balancing ego against risk. They retreat immediately, often shamefully, undignified, abandoning property and status. This looks like cowardice, but in collapse conditions, cowardice frequently correlates with survival, while courageous defense of positions correlates with death. Prepared individuals' confidence also shapes social interaction during crisis. They approach others from assumed strength, believing capability confers negotiating power. This is visible in body language, speech, and decision speed, subtle signals that broadcast confidence. In some contexts, this works. In others, it provokes violence from people who perceive confidence as threat or challenge. The unprepared approach interactions from genuine weakness. That weakness often elicits assistance or dismissal rather than conflict. They are not performing strategy. They are authentically desperate, and desperation de-escalates. There is also temporal overconfidence. Prepared individuals believe they can outlast initial chaos because they possess extended supplies. This belief encourages waiting in dangerous areas, assuming stability will return on a predictable timeline. Prepared individuals assume crisis follows historical patterns: acute disruption followed by stabilization. When collapse intensifies or extends beyond their supply horizon, the decision to wait becomes a trap. They have waited too long. Escape routes close. The neurological mechanism is critical. Confidence suppresses anxiety signals that normally heighten caution. The unprepared experience constant anxiety, keeping threat detection at maximum sensitivity. They interpret ambiguity as danger. They avoid uncertainty. This creates false positives. But in collapse conditions, false positives keep you alive. False negatives kill. Prepared individuals' confidence reduces anxiety, lowering threat sensitivity. They interpret ambiguous cues charitably, assume manageability, and miss warnings terrified people detect immediately. Disaster psychology research confirms this pattern. Trained populations often delay evacuation longer than untrained ones because training generates belief in control. That delay frequently proves fatal when situations escalate faster than expected. Prepared individuals trust they will recognize the evacuation threshold. In genuinely novel crises, that threshold is invisible, until escape is no longer possible. The final irony is devastating. Preparation was intended to reduce risk. Instead, its psychological effects, confidence, investment bias, identity protection, reduced anxiety, increase risk-taking precisely when caution ensures survival. Supplies matter less than the cognitive transformations preparation produces. Survival in true collapse requires assuming you are not capable, treating every situation as uncontrollable, and choosing retreat over engagement regardless of ego. The unprepared survive initial collapse not despite their fear, but because of it. Terror drives avoidance, caution, withdrawal, submission. These responses are not dignified. They do not validate narratives of self-reliance. but they correlate with staying alive. While confidence gets people killed defending positions and resources
are supposed
that
to
were
be
never
force
worth dying.
multipliers.
Shared skills, distributed resources, mutual defense. In practice, they fragment faster and more violently than randomly assembled survivor groups, often becoming more dangerous to their own members than any external threat. The reason is not betrayal or cowardice, it is structural. Prepared groups are built on assumptions that collapse destroys. Ad hoc groups form around realities that collapse creates. Begin with the foundation problem. Prepared groups form during stable times around shared ideology and planning. Members bond over beliefs about risk, self-reliance, and distrust of institutions. They develop plans, assign roles, and establish hierarchies based on peacetime competencies. This creates cohesion in the abstract, agreement when principles cost nothing. But these groups optimize for imagined scenarios. When reality diverges, the shared framework holding them together evaporates. This is expectation miblum at scale. Every member enters crisis with a mental model of how the group will function. Member A expects equal distribution. Member B expects hierarchical allocation. Member C expects contribution-based rationing. None of these expectations were stress-tested under real scarcity. When crisis hits and resources must be allocated under actual constraint, incompatible assumptions collide immediately. The resource problem escalates rapidly. Prepared groups know who has what. They have pooled supplies or mapped individual stockpiles. This creates instant conflict over access and distribution. Who contributed more? Who has stronger claims? How are skills weighed against supplies? In theory, these questions were settled during planning. In practice, tolerance for inequality collapses under stress. The member with hungry children will not accept smaller rations gracefully. The member who contributed more will resent equal distribution. Every formula produces resentment. Resentment under scarcity becomes violence. Now contrast this with ad hoc groups. They form during crisis with zero pre-existing expectations. No promises, no entitlement, no historical agreements to violate. Resources are pooled because pooling increases survival probability right now, not because of peacetime commitments. Distribution is negotiated in real time, under real constraints. Outcomes are accepted because no one feels betrayed. There is no violated social contract to weaponize. These groups are fragile in different ways, but they lack the expectation infrastructure that causes prepared groups to implode. The hierarchy problem accelerates collapse from within. Prepared groups assign leadership based on peacetime traits, organization, charisma, planning ability, or who founded the group. In real crisis, different attributes dominate. Medical competence, tactical experience becomes visibly misaligned, but it is already reinforced by social investment and EGO. This creates challenge dynamics. Members with relevant crisis skills but low peacetime status question leadership. Leaders whose authority was never tested under threat make decisions that appear wrong to those with actual expertise. Stepping down would expose the hierarchy as arbitrary, undermining the group's legitimacy. So leaders double down, asserting authority through force or social pressure. The group fractures into loyalists and dissidents. Energy shifts inward. Violence follows, or capable members are expelled for threatening authority. Ad hoc groups avoid this. Leadership emerges organically from demonstrated capability under real conditions. Authority is fluid, shifting as situations change. This is not more fair or ethical. It is simply aligned with survival reality, rather than planning session abstractions. Now consider the commitment paradox. Prepared members have invested time, resources, and social capital. That investment creates pressure to preserve cohesion even when fragmentation would be strategically correct. Leaving means admitting the investment was wasted. This produces collective denial. Members remain in deteriorating, dangerous groups longer than they should, trapped by sunk costs at the group level. Ideology cuts deeper than most groups realize. Prepared groups often form around political or philosophical alignment. These bonds are strong in stability and toxic under stress. When crisis demands pragmatic deviation, ideology fractures the group. Trade with outsiders? Accusations of betrayal. Cooperate temporarily with authorities? Ideological suspicion. The group splits into purists and pragmatists, each viewing the other as compromised. Ad hoc groups form around necessity, not ideology. Members may disagree on everything, but ideology is irrelevant when the immediate problem is water, shelter, or evasion. There are no purity tests, no doctrine to enforce, only one question: does this increase survival right now? This transactional cooperation is not noble, but it is resilient. Trust dynamics invert expectations. Prepared groups assume pre-crisis relationships create stronger trust. In reality, crisis reveals behaviors that contradict peacetime identities. Discovering that someone you planned with for years becomes unreliable under threat destroys trust catastrophically. You feel betrayed because they violated your model of who they were. Ad hoc groups have no such models. Trust forms from observed behavior under real stress. It is calibrated, not idealized. There is less bonding, but also less disillusionment. Finally, the violence threshold. Prepared groups distribute weapons and training, assuming this enhances defense. It also makes internal conflict instantly lethal. Disputes over resources, leadership, or ideology occur among armed individuals in close proximity, with no external authority and collapsing impulse control. What prevented violence before, law, reputation, future consequences, is gone. Ad hoc groups often have asymmetric or minimal armament. This limits escalation. Power dynamics are clearer, and violence is less immediately terminal. Prepared groups face the worst-case scenario: multiple armed members, pre-existing grievances, violated expectations, and no mediation mechanism beyond force. Prepared groups optimize against external threats while creating internal vulnerabilities they never planned for. Ad hoc groups are weaker externally, but more resilient internally, because they form around reality rather than expectation. In extended collapse, internal cohesion often matters more than tactical capability. That is why carefully planned preparedness networks so often destroy themselves, while randomly assembled groups with no ideology and no promises problems. It makes you worse at novel ones. This is not a minor trade-off. It is a fundamental cognitive limitation that prepared individuals systematically build into themselves while believing they are developing capability. The more you train specific responses, the less cognitive flexibility you retain for situations your training never anticipated. The neurological mechanism is well established. Skill acquisition works by creating efficient neural pathways that automate complex tasks. When you train something repeatedly, your brain converts effortful, conscious processing into automatic procedural memory. This is extraordinarily valuable in stable domains where the same problems recur reliably. A surgeon who has performed a procedure 1,000 times can execute it with minimal conscious thought, freeing cognitive resources for unexpected complications. But that efficiency depends on domain stability. The anatomy does not change. The tools are standardized. The environment is controlled. This exposes the deeper problem with preparation as most people practice it. Prepared individuals train for scenario types: home defense, bug-out procedures, water procurement, shelter construction. Each skill is optimized for a specific problem class. But novel situations do not arrive as clean problem classes. They arrive as hybrid conditions: negotiation, threat assessment, resource evaluation, and escape planning occurring simultaneously. Your brain attempts to categorize the situation into a known template so it can deploy a trained response. That categorization delay and the inevitable miscategorization gets people killed or commits them to actions that cannot be reversed. Now contrast this with someone who has no training. To them, every situation is genuinely novel. Their brain is not searching for pattern matches or rehearsed procedures. They are forced into conscious, effortful problem solving from first principles. This is slower. It feels inefficient. It feels like uncertainty, but it is responsive to reality, not to trained assumptions about what reality should be. They see what is actually in front of them, not what their training expects to find. Research on expertise supports this. Studies show that deep domain knowledge creates perceptual narrowing. Experts literally see different things than novices when observing the same situation, because perception is filtered through expertise. In stable domains, this is advantageous. Radiologists see tumors that untrained eyes miss. In unstable domains, it is catastrophic. The expert sees what their expertise primes them to see and misses novel variables that do not fit their mental model. There is also the problem of first-order versus second-order effects. Collapse scenarios offer no such stability. The domain shifts continuously. The problems you face today have different parameters than yesterday's, and tomorrow's will be different again. Infrastructure that worked this morning fails by afternoon. Groups that were neutral yesterday become hostile today. Resources accessible last week are contested now. In this environment, trained responses become actively counterproductive because they execute automatically before conscious analysis can recognize that conditions have changed. Here is what this looks like in practice. You have trained extensively for home defense, clearing rooms, establishing fields of fire, coordinating with teammates. When a threat approaches your position, those trained responses activate immediately. You fall into rehearsed procedures. But the actual situation is not a home invasion. It is a probe by an organized group assessing your capabilities before a planned raid. Your trained response just handed them intelligence. Your numbers, your weapon types, your reaction speed, your tactical sophistication. The appropriate response would have been appearing weak, disorganized, and unworthy of further attention. But your training executed before strategic preparation, as most people practice it. Prepared individuals train for scenario types: home defense, bug-out procedures, water procurement, shelter construction. Each skill is optimized for a specific problem class, but novel situations do not arrive as clean problem classes. They arrive as hybrid conditions: negotiation, threat assessment, resource evaluation, and escape planning occurring simultaneously. Your brain attempts to categorize the situation into a known template so it can deploy a trained response. That categorization delay and the inevitable miscategorization gets people killed or commits them to actions that cannot be reversed. Now contrast this with someone who has no training. To them, every situation is genuinely novel. Their brain is not searching for pattern matches or rehearsed procedures. They are forced into conscious, effortful problem solving from first principles. This is slower. It feels inefficient. It feels like uncertainty, but it is responsive to reality, not to trained assumptions about what reality should be. They see what is actually in front of them, not what their training expects to find. Research on expertise supports this. Studies show that deep domain knowledge creates perceptual narrowing. Experts literally see different things than novices when observing the same situation, because perception is filtered through expertise. In stable domains, this is advantageous. Radiologists see tumors that untrained eyes miss. In unstable domains, it is catastrophic. The expert sees what their expertise primes them to see, and misses novel variables that do not fit their mental model. There is also the problem of first-order versus second-order effects. Prepared individuals train for first-order problems: securing water, defending positions, treating injuries. These are immediate, direct challenges. But collapse produces cascading second-order effects that trained responses do not address. You secure water for your household. First-order problem solved. Second-order effect: you become the only source of clean water in your area. turning you into a magnet for desperation and violence. Your preparation solved the problem and created a larger one. This pattern repeats everywhere. You bug out to a rural location. First-order problem solved. Second-order effect. Rural areas become battlegrounds between refugees and locals defending resources. You establish visible group security. First-order problem addressed. Second-order effect. You become a priority target for larger, better organized groups. Trained responses handle immediate challenges while creating downstream consequences that often prove more dangerous than the original threat. The unprepared do not face this problem in the same way. They are not efficiently solving first-order challenges. They are improvising through each moment. But improvisation responds to the entire situation, including second-order effects, because there is no trained tunnel vision narrowing focus. They are forced to see the whole problem at once and respond to all of it. There is also a cognitive flexibility cost to training. Creative problem-solving requires holding multiple solutions in mind, tolerating ambiguity, and synthesizing incomplete information. This is cognitively expensive and uncomfortable. Training exists in part to eliminate this discomfort by providing procedures that remove the need for creative thought. When a problem arises, you do not generate options, you execute. This creates brittle capability. You are extremely effective inside your trained domain and nearly helpless outside it. The untrained individual remains mediocre at everything, but mediocrity works across problem types, while specialization fails catastrophically when relevance disappears. Consider the adaptation timeline. In the first days of collapse, trained individuals dominate. You purify water while others get sick. You manage light discipline while others expose themselves. Training pays immediate dividends, but conditions evolve. By week 3, water sources are contested. Light discipline is irrelevant against thermal imaging. Organized groups neutralize your advantages. Your trained responses no longer apply, yet you continue executing them, because training produces consistency, not adaptability. The unprepared spent week 1 barely surviving. They made mistakes, suffered consequences, and learned directly from reality. By week 3, they have developed adaptive capacity. Not better training, but better learning. This is the adaptation deficit created by preparation. You optimized for rapid execution of known solutions. You traded flexibility for efficiency. In short-term, predictable crises, this trade works. In extended, novel collapse conditions, it is lethal. The final irony is this: the unprepared develop these capabilities through necessity. They have no fallback procedures, so they must adapt. Their weakness forces growth. The prepared trained that growth out of themselves. By the time collapse reaches its second and third order cascades, the adaptive unprepared often outlast the trained prepared, not despite their lack of preparation, but because that lack preserved the very cognitive flexibility that training means to use violence. It creates psychological pressure to use it. This is moral hazard in its purest form. Having defensive capability fundamentally alters your decision calculus in ways that make violent confrontation more likely, often in situations where avoidance would have ensured survival. The mechanism is straightforward. When you have nothing worth defending and no means to defend it, your response to potential threat is simple: leave. The unprepared person sees someone approaching with ambiguous intent and retreats immediately. No calculation is required. They have no resources to protect, no capacity to project force, no attachment to location. Fear produces the optimal strategic response: avoidance. The prepared individual faces the same ambiguous approach and runs a completely different calculation. They have stockpiles that took years to accumulate. They have defensive positions they fortified. They have weapons and training. Most critically, they have a psychological investment in not being victims, in being the person who stands their ground rather than runs, so they do not retreat. They assess the threat, evaluate their defensive capability, and often choose to hold position, or even confront the approaching party, to establish dominance and deter future incursions. This feels rational in the moment. You're defending resources, protecting investments, demonstrating strength. But you've just accepted engagement in a situation where the other party's intent is still ambiguous. Maybe they were simply passing through. Maybe they were probing but would have moved on if you had appeared to have nothing. Maybe they were looking for easy targets and would have avoided hardened ones. You'll never know, because you've already committed to confrontation. The presence of weapons creates its own psychological dynamic. Research on moral licensing shows that possessing defensive tools creates permission structures for their use. If you have a gun, situations start appearing as appropriate context for deploying it. This isn't conscious, it's a cognitive shift. Your brain begins categorizing scenarios as requires armed response in ways it never would if you were unarmed. The tool creates the category, and the category justifies the tool's use. This operates at the level of threat perception. The armed person perceives more situations as threatening. They unconsciously scan for context where their defensive capability is relevant. The unarmed person's threat filter is calibrated differently. They are scanning for situations requiring escape, not engagement. Same environment, same stimuli, completely different risk assessments, based purely on whether you have the means to fight back. Now add commitment escalation. You've invested in defensive preparations, weapons, ammunition, training, fortifications. That investment creates psychological pressure to validate itself through use. Not using your preparations when threat appears feels like wasting your investment, admitting you overprepared, or worse, being too cowardly to employ capabilities you've cultivated. The threshold for engagement drops progressively. Each investment in preparation lowers the bar for what constitutes sufficient threat to justify defensive violence. The tragic irony is this: the more prepared you are, the more likely you are to enter violent confrontations you could have avoided. The unprepared person, lacking both means and psychological investment, avoids these confrontations through flight or submission. These responses feel shameful. They violate conventional ideas of courage. They contradict narratives of self-reliance, but they keep you alive, where confrontation would get you killed. Consider the strategic mathematics. In any violent engagement, death is a risk, regardless of preparation. Maybe you win, maybe you don't. Even if you win, you may be injured, expend irreplaceable ammunition, or create secondary threats from the confrontation's aftermath. The expected value calculation should weigh all these risks against the alternative, appearing to have nothing and being passed over entirely. But the prepared individual doesn't run this calculation objectively. Their psychology is distorted by investment bias, moral licensing from possessing tools, and identity protection around being someone who doesn't run. They weigh confrontation outcomes optimistically and avoidance outcomes pessimistically. Standing and fighting feels right in ways that fleeing never will, even when fleeing offers greater no such distortion. They have nothing making violence feel justified, nothing that pressures them to engage. Every confrontation is pure risk, with no upside beyond survival. So they escape, they submit, they negotiate from positions of obvious weakness. None of this validates their ego, none confirms their identity. But ego and identity are peacetime luxuries, and in collapse, luxuries get you killed. There's also the question of when violence is necessary versus when it feels necessary. Prepared individuals, having invested in violent capability, experience psychological pressure to identify situations requiring that capability. This creates a perceptual bias. Threats appear imminent sooner than they really are. Violence seems unavoidable earlier than reality warrants. The unprepared, lacking such capability, maintain longer ambiguity periods, where situations might still resolve non-violently. This timing difference is often fatal. The prepared engage at hour 1, when violence could have been avoided. The unprepared delay until hour 6, by which time threats may have moved on or circumstances have shifted. The prepared person's early engagement creates the violent outcome that avoidance would have prevented. They tell themselves the violence was necessary, but necessity is partly determined by your own response pattern. The fortification problem compounds this. Once you've built defensive positions, those positions become sticky, psychologically and practically. You are optimized to fight there. Leaving means abandoning advantages you've created. The unprepared have no fortifications making them sticky. Every location is equivalent. They flow towards safety, not defend positions. There is a deep psychological trap around dignity and self-conception. Prepared individuals see themselves as protectors, providers, survivors who won't be victims. These identities require validation through action. Retreating contradicts identity. Fighting confirms it. Psychological need drives tactical decisions, even when survival probability favors avoidance. The final dimension: risk tolerance and resource defense. 1 week of food, maybe fight to defend. 1 year of food, maybe fight to defend. Rationally, the person with 1 year of food could abandon a month's supply and still survive. The unprepared, with 2 days of food, should be more desperate. But desperation produces flight, while investment produces fight. This is moral hazard. Preparation gives both means and pressure for violence, while reducing actual necessity for it. You are more likely to fight precisely when you could afford not to. The unprepared are less likely to fight, despite having little to lose, because their calculations are pure survival, free of ego, investment, and identity distortion. The outcome is predictable and tragic. Prepared individuals enter violent confrontations that kill them, defending resources they could abandon and positions they could escape. Unprepared individuals survive through undignified retreat, preserving life at the cost of pride. In collapse conditions, pride is a luxury. Most prepared individuals are optimizing for the wrong time frame entirely. They stockpile for either immediate acute crisis, 2 weeks of disruption, maybe a month, or they plan for distant post-collapse sustainability with gardens and renewable systems. What they miss is the middle duration, the months-long window where the rule of law has disintegrated, but new stable orders haven't emerged. This is where most people die, and it's exactly the period most preparation strategies ignore. The psychology behind this is understandable. Short-term preparation feels achievable and concrete. You can visualize weathering a hurricane, a grid failure, a supply chain disruption lasting weeks. Long-term preparation feels heroic and meaningful, building sustainable systems, developing deep skills, creating resilient communities. Both timeframes offer psychological satisfaction. The middle duration offers none. It's too long to simply wait out, too chaotic to build sustainable systems within, and too uncertain to plan for concretely. So prepared individuals skip over it in their planning, which means they're catastrophically unready for the exact period that kills most people. Consider the standard preparation model: 3 to 6 months of stored food and supplies. This seems responsible. It covers extended disruptions while remaining financially and logistically feasible for most people. But look at what happens in actual collapse scenarios. The first month is chaotic, but still contains remnants of social order. Police exist, even if overwhelmed. Some stores remain open with depleted inventory. Distribution networks function sporadically. Most people can survive this period through a combination of existing supplies, emergency services, and residual infrastructure. By month 3, your stockpiles are halfway depleted. This is exactly when conditions become most dangerous. Initial emergency responses have failed or withdrawn. Opportunistic violence has evolved into organized predation. Resource concentration has become fully visible. Supply lines have completely broken down. And you're now defending dwindling stockpiles in an environment where violence has become normalized and authority has evaporated. Your supplies run out precisely when you need them most, and when replenishment is impossible. The prepared individual's timeline assumption is linear. Crisis hits, situation deteriorates, you survive on stockpiles, order is restored, you emerge intact. This is how short-term disasters work. It's not how systemic collapse works. Actual collapse involves cyclical chaos, false recoveries followed by renewed deterioration, temporary stability followed by sudden escalation, periods of hope followed by crushing setbacks. You can't wait it out because there's no definitive endpoint to wait for. This creates what could be called preparation horizon mismatch. Your supplies are calibrated for a specific duration based on assumptions about the crisis timeline, but the actual timeline is indeterminate. Maybe collapse extends for years. Maybe it never fully resolves into either recovery or stable post-collapse order. Your 3-month supply becomes a countdown timer, creating progressively more desperate decision-making as depletion approaches. You're locked into that timeline now. You've bet your survival on crisis resolution within your supply window. The unprepared face no such temporal commitment. They're not counting down against a supply deadline. They're not invested in any particular timeline. Each day is simply the next problem to solve. This sounds more desperate, and in some ways it is, but it also creates radical adaptability. They're not waiting for conditions to improve because they have no supplies enabling waiting. They're forced to adapt to conditions as they exist right now, which often means leaving dangerous areas, joining groups for immediate mutual benefit, or finding ways to integrate into whatever local order is emerging. Prepared individuals often can't make these moves because they're temporally committed. They have supplies that will last another 2 months, which makes staying seem rational compared to abandoning those supplies. But those 2 months might span the most dangerous period of collapse, during which staying in place defending stockpiles is precisely what gets you killed. The supplies that were supposed to provide security have become a temporal trap, preventing adaptive responses to deteriorating conditions. There's also the false recovery problem. Collapse rarely proceeds linearly from bad to worse. There are periods of apparent stabilization where it seems like the worst is over. Prepared individuals, watching their supply countdown, experience intense pressure to believe these false recoveries are real. They need the crisis to end before their stockpiles do, so they interpret ambiguous signals optimistically. They emerge from defensive postures too early, attempt to return to normal patterns, and get caught in the next wave of deterioration without having replenished supplies. Having no supply timeline creating psychological pressure can assess these periods more objectively. They're not invested in believing recovery is happening. If conditions seem to improve, they take advantage tactically without assuming permanence. If deterioration resumes, they haven't committed to assumptions requiring continued stability. Their lack of temporal investment creates clearer threat perception. Now examine the long-term preparation strategy. The people planning for sustained post-collapse existence with gardens, livestock, renewable energy, skill development. This is admirable in many ways and potentially viable if you survive to the period where it matters. But it contains a fatal assumption that you'll survive the transition to get there. Long-term sustainable systems take time to establish and require stable conditions to function. Gardens need growing seasons. Livestock needs security and feed sources. Renewable systems need maintenance and parts. During the chaotic middle duration, none of this helps you. Your garden is raided or trampled. Your livestock is stolen or eaten by desperate neighbors. Your solar panels are visible markers of capacity that make you a target. The skills that matter in sustained post-collapse are irrelevant during the violent transition period. You've optimized for year 5 when you need to survive month 4, and month 4 is where statistics focused entirely on the next 48 hours. Where is immediate safety? How do I get water today? Where can I sleep tonight without being vulnerable? These are the timeframes that actually matter during chaos. The ability to answer these questions adaptively, without commitment to any location or strategy beyond immediate survival, is what carries people through the transition period that kills long-term planners before their plans become relevant. There's a resource depletion psychology that compounds this. As your stockpiles diminish, your decision-making degrades. You're experiencing progressive scarcity stress. You're making increasingly desperate calculations about rationing. You're watching your margin of safety evaporate. This creates cognitive load that impairs judgment exactly when you need clear thinking most. You also become more risk-seeking as reserves decline, more willing to engage in dangerous resupply attempts, more likely to defend remaining resources violently, more prone to making high-variance bets because conservative strategies guarantee eventual depletion. The unprepared experience a different psychology. They're always at or near zero, which is terrifying but cognitively simple. They're not managing depletion curves or making rationing calculations. They're in pure, immediate survival mode, which actually produces clearer decision-making about present threats, because there's no complex resource management creating cognitive load. The final temporal trap is retirement of defensive capability. Maintaining high-alert defensive postures is exhausting. Humans can't sustain peak vigilance indefinitely. Prepared individuals burn out their defensive intensity over weeks or months, exactly as the environment becomes most dangerous. They're still defending their position, but with degraded alertness, slower response times, and decision fatigue. Meanwhile, threats have evolved and organized. Your defensive capability peaks early when threats are disorganized, then declines as threats become more sophisticated. The unprepared never establish defensive postures requiring sustained high alert. They're mobile, avoiding rather than defending, which is cognitively less demanding long-term. They don't burn out their vigilance because they're not trying to hold positions. They maintain sustainable alertness levels calibrated to movement and avoidance rather than static defense. Preparation creates temporal commitments to supply durations, to defensive timelines, to assumptions about crisis progression that prove catastrophically misaligned with actual collapse dynamics. The unprepared, lacking any temporal framework beyond immediate survival, adapt to whatever timeline reality imposes. They don't plan to survive, they simply survive, one day at a time, which turns out to be the only planning horizon that reliably corresponds to how collapse points to the same conclusion. In actual collapse scenarios, survival advantage correlates inversely with preparation, not because supplies or skills are useless, but because the psychology of preparedness creates fatal vulnerabilities that outweigh tactical advantages. The people who survive extended collapse are disproportionately those who appeared weak, knew they were unprepared, and maintained the cognitive flexibility that comes from having nothing invested in any particular outcome. This isn't theoretical. Look at historical collapse case studies across different contexts: Sarajevo's siege, Lebanon's civil war, Venezuela's economic disintegration, Syria's societal fracture. The pattern repeats. Survivors aren't the most prepared. They're often the most adaptive. The ones who left early despite social pressure to stay. The ones who abandoned property and status without hesitation when conditions shifted. The ones who appeared to have nothing and were therefore invisible to predatory actors. The ones who made undignified compromises that preserved their lives while the principled and prepared died defending positions or resources. In Sarajevo, the people who survived the siege weren't those with the best stockpiles or most fortified apartments. Many of those people died in their homes, either from artillery, sniper fire while defending positions, or raids by organized groups who'd identified their resources. Survivors were disproportionately those who became invisible, who looked as desperate and depleted as everyone else, who had nothing visible worth taking, who moved constantly rather than defending fixed locations, who were willing to abandon everything repeatedly as threat patterns shifted. The same dynamic played out in Venezuela's collapse. The prepared middle class, holding onto property and savings, attempting to maintain their standard of living through stockpiles and defensive measures, experienced catastrophic outcomes. Many were targeted specifically because their attempts to maintain normalcy made them visible as resource holders. Those who survived often describe abandoning everything: social status, property, preparations, and becoming indistinguishable from the desperate masses. Strategic weakness as camouflage. This creates an uncomfortable framework. True collapse resilience comes from traits that contradict everything preparation culture values: humility over confidence, flexibility over planning, invisibility over capability demonstration, willingness to abandon everything over commitment to defending anything. These aren't the traits that make preparation psychologically satisfying. Preparation appeals to our desire for control, competence, and security. The traits that actually correlate with survival require accepting that you control nothing, that your competence is domain-limited and possibly irrelevant, and that security is an illusion to be abandoned rather than a condition to be built. Does this mean preparation is worthless? Not exactly. It means preparation is useful only to the extent it doesn't create the pathologies this analysis has documented. You can have supplies without becoming psychologically anchored to them. You can develop skills without assuming they'll match the problems you face. You can build capability without letting it define your identity or decision-making. This is preparedness without attachment, maintaining resources and abilities while preserving the psychological flexibility to abandon them instantly when conditions demand. But here's the trap. Most people can't do this. The act of preparing creates psychological investment. You're not just accumulating supplies, you're building an identity around readiness, creating social connections with other prepared people, developing a worldview where your preparation will prove justified and necessary. That identity and worldview create exactly the cognitive rigidity that turns preparation into vulnerability. You can't easily invest years and significant resources into preparation while remaining genuinely detached from it. The investment creates attachment.
There's also the question
of what
creates
strategic weakness actually looks like operationally. It's not simply being unprepared. It's appearing unprepared while maintaining adaptive capacity. This is profoundly difficult. If you're actually unprepared, you lack resources and skills that might prove useful. If you're prepared but appearing unprepared, you're engaging in sophisticated operational security that itself requires capability and creates cognitive load. The truly strategically weak position is occupied by people who are authentically unprepared but possess high general intelligence, cognitive flexibility, and willingness to make ruthlessly pragmatic decisions, unconstrained by ego or principle. These people are rare. They don't self-identify as preppers. They probably don't watch content like this. They're living normal lives with vague awareness that systems are fragile, but without investment in detailed preparation. When collapse occurs, they're terrified, which produces appropriate caution. They have no resources making them visible or sticky to locations. They have no training creating pattern-dependent rigidity. They have no community creating obligations or visibility. They're cognitively flexible because they've never trained that flexibility away. And critically, they're willing to do whatever survival requires. Flee, submit, betray, abandon, compromise, because they have no identity invested in being a certain type of person. This is deeply unsatisfying as a conclusion. There's no clear action implication. Don't prepare is clearly wrong. Some preparation is better than none in many scenarios. But prepare extensively creates the exact vulnerabilities this analysis has documented. Prepare moderately is vague and still creates scaled-down versions of the same pathologies. The honest answer is that collapse survival depends substantially on traits and circumstances largely outside your control. Your cognitive flexibility, your willingness to abandon everything, your capacity to make decisions unconstrained by ego or social pressure, your luck in where you are when breakdown occurs. What you can control is awareness of the traps. If you're going to prepare, at least recognize what you're building into yourself. Investment bias that will make abandoning resources psychologically difficult. Confidence that may be uncalibrated to actual capability. Pattern-dependent thinking that will miss novel threats. Visibility that marks you as a target. Temporal commitments that lock you into defending specific timelines. Group dynamics that may fracture violently. Moral permission structures that make you more likely to engage in violence. Not to eliminate them, you probably can't, but to create some possibility of overriding them when your survival depends on contradicting everything your preparation has trained you to do. The moment you need to abandon your stockpiles and run, will you be psychologically capable of doing that? When your training tells you to defend a position, but strategic assessment says retreat, can you override the training? When your prepared identity demands you act from strength, but survival requires appearing weak, can you make that choice? Most people can't. The investment is too deep. The identity is too central. The training is too automatic. Which is why the prepared die first. Not in every scenario, not inevitably, but at rates higher than their resource advantages would predict. They've optimized themselves for scenarios that don't occur, while creating vulnerabilities to the scenarios that do. There's no resolution to this paradox that leaves you feeling secure. If you prepare extensively, you've created the pathologies this analysis documents. If you don't prepare, You lack resources that might prove useful in scenarios where preparation advantages outweigh psychological disadvantages. If you try to split the difference, you're half-committed in ways that may deliver neither the benefits of preparation nor the advantages of strategic weakness. The only honest framework is radical humility. Acknowledge that you don't know what collapse will look like, that your preparations are optimized for scenarios that may not occur, that the psychology of readiness may be more dangerous than the capabilities are useful, and that survival will depend substantially on factors you can't control, including your willingness, in the moment, to abandon everything you've prepared when conditions demand it. This is the opposite of what preparation culture offers. Preparation promises control, competence, and security. The reality is that collapse survival rewards the absence of these things, or at least the appearance of their absence. The person who looks weak, appears unprepared, seems desperate, and maintains no commitments worth dying for often outlasts the capable, prepared, confident defender of resources and positions. If this analysis unsettles everything you've invested in preparation, that's appropriate. Being unsettled might be the most valuable state you can maintain. Certainty kills. Confidence creates blindness. Investment locks you into defending what you should abandon. The prepared individual who survives is the one who holds their preparation lightly enough to walk away from it entirely when that becomes the optimal move. The question you have to answer isn't whether you're prepared. It's whether you're psychologically capable of acting unprepared when that's what survival requires. Most people who've invested years into preparation can't make that choice. Their investment has become their identity. Their capabilities have become their prison. They'll die defending preparations that were supposed to save them, killed by the exact psychological mechanisms that made preparing feel necessary and right. There's no comfortable conclusion here. True collapse resilience may be fundamentally incompatible with the psychology that makes preparation appealing. The traits that drive you to prepare, desire for control, need for security, fear of helplessness, create exactly the cognitive patterns that preparation amplifies into fatal vulnerabilities. You're trying to prepare your way out of uncertainty in a scenario where embracing uncertainty completely is what keeps you alive. What does actual resilience look like? It looks like someone who prepared enough to have options, but not enough to become attached. Someone who developed capability while maintaining genuine humility about its limits. Someone who accumulated resources while preserving willingness to abandon them. Someone who appears weak when that's strategically optimal and can deploy strength only when absolutely necessary. Someone who has no identity requiring validation, no plans requiring confirmation, no investments requiring defense. If you can maintain that state while also preparing, you might survive. If you can't, if preparation has already transformed into identity, if your stockpiles have become psychological anchors, if your training has created rigid pattern matching, if your capabilities have become sources of confidence rather than tools to be deployed flexibly, then you've already created the conditions for your own death. The supplies won't save you. The training won't save you. Your preparation itself has become the primary threat you face, and you probably won't recognize that until it's too late.